Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? You probably heard it a million times. One of the biggest differences between successful people and unsuccessful people is that successful people are not afraid to take risks and unsuccessful people are. Well, I'm not going to argue against taking risks as such. And I'm not going to argue against the idea that very often being risk averse can be to your detriment if you want to accomplish something. However, I do want to take a look at the nature of risk and look at the idea like, are all risks really equal? What is actually being put up at risk? Very often what we get told is they risked it all. We hear a story about how a person risked so much money and it paid off big because they were willing to take that leap of faith. Okay, great. What would have happened had that investment gone completely bust? You hear the stories of people putting their life savings of incredible sum of money. Sums of money that very often you or I can't comprehend because we're not in that socioeconomic strata, or we can sort of comprehend and can't believe, my God, like I can't imagine putting that much money at risk. I don't even have that much money, but at least I can wrap my head around it. What would have happened had that not gone well? Would that person then been homeless? No place to live, not really sure how they're going to feed themselves or their family. Or would their place on the socioeconomic ladder have changed dramatically? Would they have had to rethink some business strategies? But would they still have a place to live? If they couldn't afford the palace anymore, could they afford a more modest home? Would they have to sink down to a different level of society and be my neighbor? I think you're getting the point. Very often, there is, you can watch 100 different YouTube videos and read articles, and the tone can be quite condescending. The difference is, you're afraid to take risk, and we're not afraid to take risk. What would happen if you or I took some of those same risks? There's a guy, and I cannot remember his name right now. He has a channel or a website. It's called Pitchfork Economics. He's a billionaire. And one of the things or probably the big thing that catapulted him into the major success was he was the first non-family investor into Amazon. And I think he put up something like his entire life savings, which is $45,000. And I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but it seems like he would have been right around in his 30s. Now, did you have $45,000 to invest in anything when you were in your 30s? Maybe you did. I sure didn't. Different ladder, different experience. And what would have happened had that $45,000 vanished? Would he have been broke or homeless? I can tell you that if I borrowed that much money to just put into a brick and mortar business or do something else and it didn't work, I would lose this house and I would be forced to try to rent an apartment for probably 2 or 3 times the amount of mortgage that I'm paying here because I get a decent rate. And those things, be incredibly different. And of course, by that time, I probably wouldn't have had a job, so I'd have to look for a job, and the bills would start cascading and be months and months unpaid, and then bankruptcy, and who knows? And I know people that have had their brick and mortar businesses fail and end up working at Home Depot trying to make ends meet after something like that. I do have friends on different economic strata who have taken big risks. I remember, a good friend of mine that I play, in bands with, his family, owns a number of businesses, and, he's like 3rd generation owner. They built some condominiums in Florida right before the economic bust quite some time ago. And then they had to sit on them for years. It was supposed to be this big thing, and they lost a lot of money. They were finally able to sell them, but it was this long haul. Did it change their lifestyle dramatically? No. It changed it a little bit differently, but they still had places to live. They had to work a little harder. So I'm not downsizing or downplaying the hit they took, but the consequences were different than it would be for somebody else at a different economic level. There's this great scene in West Wing, and I'm dating myself now, where the president and a lot of his advisors, who are all there working for peanuts, but they're all millionaires, the people members of his cabinet and his speechwriters and what have you, they're asking each other, what's the price of a gallon of milk right now? Does anybody know? Because they're trying to write some kind of article about how the American public is suffering. And then the assistant to the president, who is a normal person like you or I, comes in and he says, oh, it's this much. And everybody else says, really? It costs that much? Is that a lot? because they're completely removed from the experience of the average person, because such things really aren't of consequence to them. They might look at the milk and say, gee, that seems expensive, I guess, put it in the cart and let's get this other thing too. And trust me, I'm not throwing rocks at rich people, and I'm not talking about a class war. Just talking about this idea of the nature of risk. Yes, I believe it's necessary to take risks to do anything. However, I am against, or I do get offended by the condescending tone that we often hear, because the risks that the average person would have to take would have very dire consequences. The resources that we have to put at risk are either far more precious to us, or we simply don't have them in the first place. So what we do have to put at risk are other commodities that are less limited, like our time. Doing something like this, putting effort into a YouTube channel, or throwing effort into learning, music, and putting more, stuff like that. I have more time to do these sorts of things. We are able to risk our, different parts of our lives. And, I believe that's necessary to succeed in anything. But these commodities aren't necessarily financial. They're not the ones that would necessarily break us. Even looking at things like courses and what have you that are offered on YouTube, and I may be shooting myself in the foot, because one day I'll probably will order, or offer like a digital product or an ebook or something like that. Because I just watched a video about somebody talking about investing in yourself, and there are different price points. And would $1,000 mean be a huge hit for me? Yeah. That's a lot of money. That means a lot of other bills don't get paid this month if I were to do something like that. Whereas something smaller, that's a different risk, if it doesn't pan out. You get the idea. So I don't know if there's a takeaway from this video, except to maybe be a little easier on yourself. Definitely take the risk. Do the things you need to do to get to where you want to go, wherever that is, because success isn't just financial success by a long shot. But don't feel bad about yourself. Don't let people make you feel guilty. Don't beat yourself up watching, the talking heads saying, well, the reason you are where you are is because you're afraid to take risks. Well, what did you have to risk in the first place? What would have been the consequences had you risked, huge sums of money that you probably didn't have, or put a second mortgage on your house? You get the idea. Very often, I don't buy the stories that people really risked it all. They risked a large sum of money that seems incomprehensible to us. They risked maybe their position on the social ladder. They would have had to maybe really, figure their life out. And I'm sure some of them did risk it all, and kudos to them. But for the most part, the risks that you see people taking that are, super wealthy or they are calculated risks, and they're risks that wouldn't kill them if they went bad. Know what I mean, Jelly Bean?